I'm not much of a talker.
A new generation of heroes will rise.
You told me my family was dead.
I found her dead.
To unite a planet divided.
I don't really play video games anymore, but once upon a time I did, and Red Faction on the PlayStation 2 was one of my favourite games at the time. It was a first-person shooter which kind of reminded me a little bit of the movie Total Recall, all set on Mars. And we have this video game adaptation directed by Michael Nankin that came out in 2011. And it's one of these video game movies that I think is largely ignored and possibly even unknown by most. Now, this was made for TV, for the Sci-Fi channel, and actually based on the video game, which has somewhat of a kind of complex kind of mythology on it. So the setup for this movie is that it takes place at some point in the future, and Mars has been colonised by, you know, the people from Earth, and it's been colonised for a number of years, and the people now who have been kind of born on Mars, it's been colonised for about 200 years, I believe, want independence from Earth. So there is a kind of an uprising, and it's led by this kind of revolutionary guy, and this kind of faction of uprisings they're all miners and things like this, because Mars is kind of being mined and stuff. It's called Red Faction, and ultimately they kind of have this kind of war, so to speak, and are successful and kind of expunge the kind of the Earth Defence Force from Mars, and are now an independent sort of colony. And within that colony, they actually have different tribes, and this movie focuses on two of them. So you kind of have this almost like very similar setup to the American Revolutionary War in many ways. You know, you have the Americas wanting their independence from, you know, Britain and things like this. So it kind of has a similar kind of setup to that, really. So this movie takes place sometimes after these kind of wars, and we have this kind of industrialized sort of faction called the colonists, who are effectively our protagonists, and they have large industrial machine miners and things like that. You also have the marauders, which are kind of more hedonistic and kind of like live off the land a little bit more, but also have these kind of like more sort of Sin City type kind of outposts and stuff. Anyway, it focuses on this policeman from the colonists, who is the son of the kind of the original revolutionary kind of war, so to speak, and he ultimately is trying to find his sister, who went missing when this kind of conflict was kind of taking place earlier. And he thinks he sees her in this kind of like with this group of soldiers that are all kind of dressed in white fatigues. And it ultimately his quest to kind of try and find her. And then we find out this Earth Defence Force is kind of actually not 100% defeated, and have effectively a large kind of battleship hidden away. Now, what will happen? You have to watch the movie and find out. So that setup sounds relatively complex, doesn't it? And this is actually somewhat of a more mature and thoughtful sci-fi movie in many ways. So let's discuss what I think works in this movie. So obviously, it's based on a video game which has this kind of lore already kind of set up. So it does seem like a more of a thoughtful, mature, and complex kind of narrative in some ways, at least, compared to a lot of like the typical kind of sci-fi movies that you would have got on the kind of the channel. There's no aliens in this. There's no killer robots. It is political factions within this kind of like a human kind of conflict ultimately. And then we have this kind of quite rich kind of backstory. I mean, this really focuses on the kind of like it's the post-war, so to speak. But nonetheless, it still has an interesting setup, which obviously, as I've mentioned, draws parallels from history, in particular the kind of the American Revolutionary War. So I think this setup is strong, and it has this more of a hard sci-fi, you know, feel to it, where the technology, for example, is very lived in. We see the kind of like, you know, ships flying around, and the kind of like just the world seems very kind of like dirty, lived in, and kind of more practical rather than kind of like, you know, highfalutin kind of science fiction ideas. So I think that kind of level of grittiness and a somewhat kind of like realistic portrayal of these kind of science fiction ideas is very kind of interesting. Now within that, it still has a kind of somewhat of a, you know, silly science fiction sci-fi movie channel story to a certain degree, with kind of, you know, somewhat broad characters, but there is that a nice dichotomy, I feel, between more kind of like the kind of the based on more realistic ideas, but also, you know, more kind of swashbuckling kind of action as well. So I actually think it strikes quite a good balance. I think our main kind of character is quite an interesting guy. He's not like a particularly overly kind of chatty protagonist, and I actually think he does quite well as a kind of more of a sort of stoic, you know, individual. But he's got his own mind. He has a difficult relationship with his father, played by Robert Patrick. I found him quite interesting. I found his relationships with other characters, you know, an interesting one. We meet these kind of couple of marauders on the way who are kind of like a rival, you know, clan of kind of humans, if you like, and they have their differences, but they kind of, you know, ultimately kind of end up kind of working together. So there's some good interaction, some good character moments within the movie as well. There are similarities to kind of Star Wars. It's an interesting idea to have this kind of our bad guys, so to speak, actually be from Earth. They're the Earthlings. These are the kind of people from our own planet, and they are presented as the bad guys. And, you know, they have very much like a Stormtrooper-esque kind of style, kind of troopers, all kind of dressed in white. But even within them, I feel that there is some kind of like nuance with the characters. Our kind of second in command seems, you know, he seems torn about kind of what's kind of going on and things like that. So I actually kind of quite liked the ideas, and it's even with our kind of you know, antagonists, our bad guys, how their kind of recruiting seems like, you know, they're kind of coercing people or tricking people into kind of like joining them and things like that. So not everyone is necessarily a straight bad guy. So, you know, it's a pretty interesting kind of movie in some ways, and it's presented in a kind of a, as I say, with quite a hard science fiction style aesthetic. And again, this is all based on the game, so that's obviously where it's kind of come from, but nonetheless it does feel more mature and more interesting. You know, it's relatively kind of well paced, even though it's not particularly a showy movie, I would say. It still, I think, is an interesting one because you like the setup, you like the characters, and I think you like this kind of more of a gritty, lived-in and sort of dirty kind of world, so to speak. What doesn't work, I mean, I do think there are some sillier moments, as I've said. For example, there's a sequence where we have these two marauders who are armed with hand-to-hand combat weapons, and they face off against like a whole squad of these kind of stormtrooper-like Earth Defense Force soldiers, all of whom have guns. And then the movie cuts away, and then we come back and all these kind of soldiers are on the floor, and our two marauders are completely unharmed. Like, well, hang on a second, didn't these soldiers use guns? They were at a distance initially. It's like, what is, you know, it's just silly. I mean, either they didn't want to pay for a kind of a fight scene, or at least they had to have an idea about how two kind of like effectively guys with hand-to-hand weapons have overcome a kind of squad of soldiers who have been presumably trained with kind of like projectile weapons. Bit silly. Kind of sequences like that. There's a sequence where, well, without kind of giving anything away, we have a character who has been indoctrinated into this kind of this Earth Defense Force, and she apparently has no memory of her past life, but they've never explained how that's happened or why that has happened. She just has. And you think, well, how have they done that? It's never kind of addressed. So there's ideas here that are kind of just kind of glossed over. So this is what I mean. It's kind of a mix between this kind of sillier kind of ideals mixed in with at least a sort of structure of a kind of more of a hard science fiction sort of setup. One of the things I feel looks, maybe watching it these days, is the CGI does show. I mean, it's a lower budget movie, made for TV, so the CGI and the VFX were never going to be fantastic, and you know that you can pick them apart because yes, they look like clearly CGI, you know, ships and things like that. But But, you know, I think the design is fine. If you don't mind, if you can live with the kind of like CGI kind of silliness, then there is that. But what I will say, on the plus side again, some of the location shooting is very good. You know, I think it was filmed in Bulgaria, and we have this kind of large kind of like industrial sort of factories and things that the kind of like the colonists or the Red Faction are all kind of set against. And it looks great. I think it looks very, you know, very kind of like Soviet era kind of like kind of aesthetics. There is that. But yeah, some of the CGI isn't so good, to be honest with you. And our bad guys, I gotta say, they're a little bit of a cut price empire. I mean, our kind of our finale, so to speak, ends up with this kind of effectively our Earth Defense Force, our bad guys, wanting to shoot a large Death Star-like laser at our kind of colonists and things, and it's just like, man, it seems a little bit too much like Star Wars. You know, you've got all your soldiers dressed in white, and then they're kind of useless apparently as well. So there's a little bit of kind of element where they've just taken ideas from other things, and I think not quite stuck to the mythology laid out by the game, really. But overall, it's a decent movie. I think it's a particularly kind of like mature movie for the Sci-Fi channel at the very least, and has some interesting kind of setups and ideas and characters, and kind of the world is very interesting, and he has that political kind of edge to it as well. So I will say I think this is an above average movie. You know, let down by some silliness. But I have to be honest, I would give this one a 7 out of 10. I think it's a reasonable science fiction movie if you don't mind the clear lower budget and the fact that it's obviously made for TV. But it has some interesting elements to it. So it's a 7 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.